For much of the 20th century, Britain's military airfields lived according to routine. Planes inspected before dawn, guards walking lonely patrols, engineers working through the night beneath floodlights, and crews waiting for a telephone to ring or a siren to sound. Most days, nothing happened, yet everyone remained ready. The Cold War demanded that kind of vigilance. For decades, men and women served at places like RAF Upper Heyford, Bruntingthorpe and Cottesmore, preparing for a conflict they hoped would never come. Fortunately, it never did. And so aircraft were retired, bases closed or found new purpose, and life moved on. Yet for a few, something stayed behind. Because among the stories of these airfields, alongside memories of service and sacrifice, are quieter accounts. These aren't about battles or great acts of heroism. They're tales of ordinary people carrying out ordinary duties, as though, in places that spent so long standing watch, some routines never truly came to an end. Join me as I explore 3 of Britain's Cold War airfields, where history, memory, and mystery still seem to stand together on watch. Our journey begins in rural Leicestershire. A few days ago, I happened to drive past a place that, from the road, reveals little of its remarkable past. Beyond the perimeter fence, behind trees and acres of concrete, lies the former RAF Bruntingthorpe. Today, much of the airfield is hidden from view, its long runway and surviving buildings glimpsed only through gaps in the fencing. But for decades, this was a place where engines thundered and crews trained. And according to those who have spent time here, not all of that past has faded. RAF Bruntingthorpe opened in late 1942 as the home of No. 29 Operational Training Unit. Here, bomber crews prepared for the dangerous missions that awaited them over occupied Europe. In the years that followed, the airfield entered the jet age, contributing to the development of Britain's first operational jet fighter, the Gloucester Meteor, before assuming an altogether different role during the Cold War. In 1953, the United States Air Force transformed Bruntingthorpe into a strategic air command base, extending its runway and constructing new hangars and dispersals for American reconnaissance and bomber aircraft, standing ready in an uncertain world. Military flying eventually came to an end, but the airfield found a remarkable second life. For aviation enthusiasts, Brunty became legendary. Vulcans, Victors, Lightnings, Buccaneers and many other icons of Britain's Cold War air power gathered here, their engines returning to life during the famous Cold War jet days. Now a privately owned aerodrome and proving ground, there are few reminders of its previous life. One building has remained a constant through almost every chapter of this site's history. The old wartime control tower has quietly watched over decades of change. It is here that many of Bruntingthorpe's strangest stories begin. One of the earliest published accounts connected with haunted Bruntingthorpe comes from Bruce Barrymore Halpenny's Ghost Stations Volume 4. In it, he recounts a letter from a Leicester woman named Jean Horrocks. Jean spent years returning to the old airfield because she enjoyed its peace and solitude. She wrote that sitting there on warm summer afternoons, she would often hear something she struggled to explain. These sounds weren't roaring engines or marching footsteps, but voices. The voices of what she believed were young American airmen drifting across the airfield on the breeze. Jean admitted that she had told friends about the experience, yet never found anyone who had heard the same thing. She wondered whether they might somehow be the spirits of young men who had once laughed, worked and lived together at Bruntingthorpe, a place that was happy for them, despite the dangerous lives they led. Jean's is a remarkably restrained account. There are no shadowy figures or dramatic apparitions. Just a woman sitting in the quiet of the Leicestershire countryside, hearing voices that belonged to another time. And somehow, that makes her story all the more compelling. A far more detailed account appears in Haunted Second World War Airfields, Volume 2 by Christopher Huff. In this, Huff reproduces the testimony of a contributor writing under the name JohnnyBee. Johnny describes an experience at Bruntingthorpe during a motoring event in the summer of 1997. What makes his story especially intriguing is that, by his own admission, he knew almost nothing about the airfield. He had no interest in ghost stories, no knowledge of its wartime use, and had come to test cars. As far as he was concerned, this was just another disused airfield. As the day's events drew to a close, he found himself unable to find a hotel for the night. Rather than face a lengthy drive home, he and 2 other attendees decided to sleep in their vehicles. Before turning in, the 3 men wandered over to explore the old control tower. Its windows and doors were sealed with steel plates, but its external staircase still stood. As Johnny climbed the rusting stairs, something immediately struck him. Although the evening remained warm on the airfield below, the temperature was icy as he reached the upper landing. He called to one of his companions, Colin, who climbed up beside him and noticed the same thing. But their 3rd companion, Si, refused to join them. Instead, he turned and hurried back towards the park cars. When they caught up with him and asked what was wrong, Si appeared shaken. He admitted that while the other 2 men had been standing on the platform, he had seen 2 servicemen at the top of the tower. They seemed ordinary, standing together, smoking cigarettes and chatting, yet when he looked again, they had vanished. Johnny and Colin insisted they had seen no one. The encounter might have ended there. Instead, curiosity drew Johnny back to the tower alone. Hoping to discover some ordinary explanation, he searched around the surrounding buildings before making his way back across the apron. It was then, he wrote, that he was overcome by something altogether different. Without warning, he was gripped by an overwhelming feeling of dread, followed almost immediately by what he described as an immense sorrow. At the same time, he became aware of the deep vibration of powerful aircraft engines. He couldn't see a plane, but he later wrote that he could almost picture a pilot struggling to control one. Looking back towards the control tower, he was astonished to see that the rear door, which he was certain had been boarded over, now stood open. On the platform above were 2 figures, one dressed in flying gear, the other in military uniform. They seemed to be deep in conversation, completely unaware of his presence. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the strange scene disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Johnny to question whether he had seen a trick of an overactive imagination or an echo of some long-forgotten moment replaying itself across the years. What lends his account an unexpected credibility is the way it ends. Johnny wrote that he returned to Bruntingthorpe several times afterwards, yet he never again saw, heard, or felt anything out of the ordinary. Bruntingthorpe spent much of its life saving things that might otherwise have disappeared. Whatever comes next for the site, in a place so devoted to preserving the past, it's not surprising that some believe memories linger there too. Our next destination shares that same sense of history refusing to fade, but here, the story is different. A short distance north of Oxford lies RAF Upper Heyford. Established in 1917, the airfield would serve through the Second World War before assuming a significant role in the decades that followed. During the Cold War, Upper Heyford became one of the United States Air Force's most important bases in Britain. Nuclear-capable Strategic Air Command bombers arrived on regular deployments. These were followed by reconnaissance aircraft and, from 1970, the distinctive General Dynamics F-111. Known affectionately as Little America, Upper Heyford was far more than an airbase. It was a community. American servicemen and women lived, worked and raised children here. Schools, shops, cinemas and sports facilities gave the base the feel of a small town hidden behind security fences. Yet beneath that ordinary routine lay an extraordinary responsibility, the possibility that, at any moment, the Cold War might become something far more dangerous. Unlike some of the wartime stations explored in other episodes, reports here are generally quieter and less dramatic. There are no tales of phantom bombers circling overhead or ghostly airmen asking strangers for directions. One account, shared by a former security guard, describes feeling an intense and sudden cold while patrolling a particular building. The rest of the structure remained warm, yet every time he crossed one specific area, the temperature dropped like a stone. A different guard later reported experiencing exactly the same thing while carrying out the same patrol. A former employee who worked on the site after its military closure described a similar unease. Arriving for the early shift at around 3 o'clock each morning, he recalled opening up one of the converted hangars before the rest of the workforce arrived. The buildings were enormous, quiet, and, he admitted, more than a little unsettling. More than once he caught fleeting movement from the corner of his eye, only to find nothing there when he turned. On other occasions he heard unexplained banging echoing through otherwise empty buildings. Today, much of the airfield survives. The shelters, bunkers and dispersals remain, giving visitors an unusual opportunity to explore a Cold War landscape that feels almost frozen in time. Walking among these structures, it's easy to imagine the sudden wail of a siren, crews running to waiting planes, and engines roaring into life. Probably the best-known ghost story connected with Upper Heyford centres on one of these buildings, a watchtower within the former weapons storage area, known as Whiskey 13. According to a long-standing legend, a serviceman stationed there struck up a conversation with a young woman riding a horse nearby. Before they parted, they agreed to meet again. But when he later visited the farmhouse where she had said she lived, he was told she had died 2 years earlier after falling from her horse at a nearby gate. The story continues that the young woman appeared to him once more while he was on duty in the watchtower. Distressed, he radioed that she was coming for him before firing at her and taking his own life. For years afterwards, visitors claimed to see the mark left by the fatal shot, while the tale spread across the base and beyond. It is certainly a compelling story, and one that continues to be retold on guided tours of the former airbase. Yet, despite its popularity, I've been unable to find reports confirming either the alleged suicide or the riding accident said to have inspired it. Even those who served at Upper Heyford have questioned parts of the legend. One commentator says that features once pointed to as evidence may have far more ordinary explanations. Stories like this often become part of a place long before anyone thinks to ask where they began. They evolve with every retelling, becoming woven into the identity of the buildings. are the unexplained cold spots, strange noises, and persistent folklore evidence of something mysterious? Or are they the product of decades spent living under the shadow of unimaginable responsibility? It's impossible to say. But Upper Heyford remains an extraordinary place, an airbase built for vigilance, a community shaped by uncertainty, a place that spent half a century waiting for a war that thankfully never arrived. Our final stop takes us east into Rutland to an airfield whose story spans almost the entire history of military aviation. RAF Cottesmore opened in 1938. During the Second World War, it served Bomber Command before later passing briefly into American hands. In the years that followed, the station entered the nuclear age, becoming home to Britain's V-Force with the mighty Handley Page Victor bombers. Later still came the Harrier Force and the Tornado, ensuring that for much of the Cold War and beyond, Cottesmore remained at the forefront of Britain's air power. Like Upper Heyford and Bruntingthorpe, this was an airfield shaped by vigilance. Aircraft waited on dispersals. Ground crews worked through the darkness. Every inspection, every maintenance check, every patrol formed part of an unbroken cycle of readiness that lasted for decades. According to Bruce Barrymore Halpenny, reports began circulating in the early 1960s of a ghost seen on the dispersal area. Witnesses described a senior non-commissioned officer, a Chiefy, dressed in 1950s RAF battle dress with a flight bag slung over one shoulder. He was always seen doing the same thing, cycling across the airfield towards the Victor dispersals before striking something unseen and tumbling to the ground. Anyone who hurried forward to help him found nothing there. Among the accounts Halpenny records is one from December 1961. 2 members of the Victor training flight reportedly watched the cycling figure fall, only for him to vanish as they ran to the spot. More than 20 years later, in December 1986, a fitter working alone in the cockpit of a Tornado saw almost exactly the same scene. The story given to explain these sightings is tragic. It tells of a Victor crew chief who, one dark December morning, cycled across the airfield to check that the sentry guarding one of the bombers was alert. As another airman stepped into his path, the Chiefy swerved, striking the open undercarriage door of a Victor bomber with fatal consequences. This is one of the most enduring legends associated with RAF Cottesmore. Yet despite spending a considerable amount of time searching newspaper archives, other records and genealogical sources, I have been unable to find contemporary evidence confirming that the accident took place as described. That doesn't mean it never happened. Incidents on military stations were not always reported, and without access to RAF records, it is difficult to reach a firm conclusion. But it does remind me how easily stories become woven into the fabric of places like this, passed from one generation of airmen to the next, until they form part of the station itself. Did those witnesses experience an apparition, an illusion born of darkness and expectation, or did they just retell an old station legend? I don't know, but I find the image of a dedicated NCO forever trapped in a reenactment of the accident which killed him heartbreaking. For more than half a century, airfields like Upper Heyford, Bruntingthorpe and Cottesmore stood ready. Their runways waited. Their crews trained. Their planes sat fueled and prepared beneath grey skies, ready to answer the call to action. And when the Cold War ended, the planes departed. The gates closed, and the people moved away. Many of these once vital stations found new lives as museums, business parks, or communities. Officially, they had stood down. Yet the stories remained. Not stories of great battles or dramatic last stands, but quieter tales. A voice carried on the wind. An unexplained chill in an empty building. A lonely cyclist still making his rounds through the darkness. Small moments, repeated by different people across different generations, each adding another thread to the tapestry of these remarkable places. Whether they are nothing more than folklore, tricks of memory, or something that lies beyond our understanding, none of us can say with certainty. But whatever we make of the stories, these airfields remain places shaped by vigilance, by preparedness, carrying the legacy of countless ordinary men and women whose lives were devoted to keeping watch over Britain's skies during one of the most uncertain chapters in modern history. And if, on quiet evenings, some still believe those echoes can be heard, then perhaps it's because places that spend so long keeping watch never truly stand down.